broke at 21 and violently discarded by a ruthless industrial garment factory. She bought a ruined, forgotten dressmaker shop for exactly $1. But what she found hidden deep inside the canvas chest of an antique dress form changed everything. The deafening, relentless mechanical roar of the apex industrial garment factory was a highly physical, crushing force. Hundreds of heavy commercial sewing machines hammered the concrete floor simultaneously, creating a violent, constant vibration that traveled directly up through the thin soles of Clara's cheap boots and deep into her aching bones. The air inside the massive, windowless warehouse was incredibly hot, heavily saturated with thick, choking cotton dust and the sharp, bitter smell of hot machine oil. There was absolutely no room for artistry, no time for careful precision, and no respect for the fragile fabric. There was only the brutal, unforgiving quota, 300 cheap polyester shirts per heavy, grueling 12-hour shift. Clara was 21 years old. She sat hunched fiercely over her heavy industrial serger, her pale hands moving in a rapid, frantic blur of deeply trained muscle memory. She was incredibly skilled with a needle, possessing a rare, profound understanding of how heavy threads bound woven fibers together. But the massive factory did not want deep understanding. It wanted mindless, mechanical speed. As a heavy bundle of dark blue synthetic fabric moved rapidly down the loud conveyor line, Clara noticed a severe, jagged flaw in the cheap material. The seam was completely misaligned, the thin stitches pulling aggressively against the weak fabric, practically guaranteeing a massive tear the very first time the heavy garment was worn. She stopped her loud hammering machine. She reached for her small, sharp steel scissors, intending to quickly rip the bad seam out and restitch it correctly. It was a deeply ingrained, completely instinctive reflex born of a profound respect for the difficult craft of tailoring. But stopping the heavy machine instantly caused a massive, highly visible bottleneck on the rapid assembly line. Within exactly 30 seconds, the heavy, imposing floor manager was standing directly behind her narrow metal chair. He was a large, angry man with a thick red face and absolutely no patience for human error. "What are you doing, Clara?" he demanded, his loud voice cutting aggressively through the heavy mechanical roar of the massive factory floor. "The main shoulder seam is completely blown out," Clara said, her voice tight and defensive over the loud noise. "The cheap polyester thread is pulling right through the weak weave. If Mott Dante aggressively reinforce this entire heavy seam right now, the garment will completely rip apart. You don't get paid to think about the heavy seam," the manager barked fiercely, grabbing the dark blue fabric from her pale hands and tossing it carelessly back onto the rapidly moving line. "You get paid to hit the massive quota. You have deliberately stopped the heavy line 3 times this week because of your stupid obsessive perfectionism. We are manufacturing cheap, disposable volume, not custom tailored silk suit. A bad, careless seam is a massive insult to the person who has to wear it," Clara shot back, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden, fierce defiance she had kept deeply buried for 2 agonizing years. The heavy manager stared at her with deep, profound contempt. He did not yell. He simply pointed a thick, aggressive finger toward the heavy steel exit doors at the far end of the massive warehouse. "Clock out, Clara. Clean out your small metal locker. You are officially fired. Don't ever come back to this heavy floor." Clara walked out of the massive, roaring factory and into the freezing, bitter winter rain. The heavy steel doors slammed loudly shut behind her, instantly cutting off the deafening mechanical noise. The sudden, profound silence of the wet street was deeply jarring. She pulled her thin, worn canvas jacket tightly around her shivering shoulders. She was completely, utterly alone in a massive, indifferent city. She had exactly $12 in her thin leather wallet. Her small, cramped studio apartment was already 2 full months behind on rent, the bright pink eviction notice heavily taped to her peeling door just that morning. She had spent her entire young life deeply fascinated by the intricate, highly complex architecture of heavy clothing. She loved the precise mathematics of drafting complex paper patterns, the incredibly tactile, satisfying feeling of heavy wool and crisp linen, and the profound, transformative power of a perfectly tailored garment. But the brutal, highly mechanized reality of the modern industrial world had aggressively crushed her deep passion into a fine, bitter dust. She was broken, destitute, and completely lost. She began to walk aimlessly down the wet, freezing concrete sidewalk, letting the heavy, cold rain soak deeply through her thin jacket, completely unsure if she would even survive the coming night. Clara wandered aimlessly through the freezing, driving rain for 3 agonizing hours, her completely numb feet carrying her deep into the city's oldest, most heavily neglected industrial district. The massive, towering brick warehouses here had been completely abandoned decades ago, their heavy glass windows shattered, their massive loading docks choked with wet, rotting garbage. The narrow, winding cobblestone streets were deeply flooded with kep-itehat dark, freezing water. She walked with her head down, shivering violently, her thin canvas jacket completely soaked through to her freezing skin. She turned down a particularly narrow, incredibly dark alleyway, seeking a brief moment of shelter from the aggressive, biting wind. Squeezed incredibly tight between 2 massive, towering brick factories was a very small, remarkably narrow storefront. It was so deeply recessed into the heavy brick architecture that Clara had almost walked right past it without noticing. The small building was a relic of a completely different century, an intricate, highly detailed Victorian facade of carved dark wood and heavy thick plate glass. Clara stepped under the small, rotting canvas awning, deeply grateful to finally be out of the heavy, freezing rain. She leaned her wet, shivering shoulder against the cold brick wall and looked at the small shop. The heavy plate glass window was completely opaque with a thick, greasy layer of dark grey grime, but faintly visible beneath the heavy dirt, elegantly painted in peeling, highly elaborate gold leaf lettering, were the faded words, Eleanor S., custom dressmaker and tailoring, Est, Morchin Jaime High. She pressed her pale, freezing face directly against the cold, filthy glass, cupping her numb hands around her dark eyes to block the grey light of the alley. The interior of the small shop was entirely pitch black, shrouded in a heavy, undisturbed gloom. She could faintly make out the massive, dark silhouettes of heavy wooden display counters and the tall, intimidating shapes of antique dress forms standing like silent, headless ghosts in the deep shadow. The small shop looked exactly like a highly preserved, perfectly sealed tomb, completely untouched by human hands for at least 50 heavy years. Next to the heavy wooden door, nailed securely to the rotting doorframe, was a curled, heavily weathered yellow paper notice from the city tax authority. Clara peeled the damp paper carefully off the rusted nail. It was a final, aggressive notice of absolute public condemnation. The small, forgotten property had racked up decades of unpaid municipal taxes, but the massive, towering brick factories on either side made the tiny footprint of the dress shop completely useless for modern commercial redevelopment. The city was desperately trying to unload the severe liability of the rotting structure at a massive, deeply discounted public auction. The minimum opening bid was listed at mort fee exactly $1. Clara stared at the heavy, wet paper. She looked back at the beautifully carved, deeply rotting wooden facade of the forgotten tailor shop. She thought of the loud, deafening, mechanical brutality of the massive factory she had DUET day been violently fired from. She thought of the bright pink eviction notice heavily taped to her apartment door. She reached a violently trembling, freezing hand deep into the wet pocket of her thin jeans and pulled out her incredibly thin leather wallet. She had exactly 12 single-dollar bills to her name. 30 minutes later, Clara stood dripping wet in the brightly lit, deeply sterile lobby of the municipal tax office. The heavy linoleum floor was perfectly clean, contrasting sharply with her muddy, soaked boots. She walked up to the heavy bulletproof glass partition and slid the damp, curled yellow auction notice through the narrow metal slot, followed immediately by a single highly crumpled $1. The bored, heavily exhausted clerk behind the thick glass looked at the wet paper, then looked down at the single dollar bill, and finally looked up at the freezing, destitute girl standing in front of him. "You want to buy the heavy title to the old Eleanor property?" the clerk asked, his voice thick with deep, profound incredulity. "Miss, that tiny building is an absolute massive nightmare. The heavy timber roof is totally compromised. The internal plumbing has been completely dead since the late 70s. It is a severe public liability. If the rotting roof collapses and damages the massive brick factories on either side, you will be held completely legally responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in heavy structural damages. You cannot possibly live in it, and you certainly cannot open a massive modern business in an alleyway that narrow." "Mort have exactly $1, Clara said, her voice shaking violently from the deep, biting cold, but her dark eyes completely hard and deeply unyielding. "Is the massive auction still officially open?" The clerk stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the desperate, crushing exhaustion in her pale face, but he also recognized a deeply stubborn, fierce, highly irrational determination. He sighed heavily, a sound of profound administrative defeat. He typed rapidly on his heavy plastic keyboard, printed out a thick stack of complex legal forms, and slid them through the narrow metal slot along with a cheap plastic pen. "Sign the heavy red lines," the clerk said flatly. "You are buying the massive property completely as is, with all heavy, existing liabilities entirely transferred to your legal name. May God have deep mercy on your freezing soul." Clara gripped the cheap plastic pen. Her pale hand shook so violently that she could barely form the heavy letters of her own name, but she signed every single thick document. She pushed the heavy stack of papers back through the metal slot. The clerk heavily stamped them, sliding a massive, deeply rusted iron skeleton key and a heavy manila folder back to her. Clara walked out of the warm municipal building and back into the freezing, driving rain. She was 21 years old. She was completely unemployed, totally broke, and officially homeless. But her pale fingers gripped the heavy cold iron key with incredible, fierce strength. She owned a completely ruined, severely condemned dressmaker shop. It was a massive, highly dangerous liability, a total disaster of rotting wood and dead history. But as she walked the long, freezing miles back to the dark alleyway, she felt a profound, heavy weight settle deep in her chest. It was the absolute crushing reality of massive physical ownership. She had nowhere else in the entire freezing world. Clara stood in the dark, freezing alleyway, the heavy rain hammering loudly against the small, rotting canvas awning above her head. She gripped the massive, deeply rusted iron skeleton key in her cold, trembling hand. The heavy brass lock set deeply into the thick wooden door of the old dressmaker shop looked completely fused with decades of dark green corrosion. She slid the cold iron key into the wide keyhole and pushed hard. It resisted completely, grinding loudly against the heavily rusted internal tumblers. She braced her verkepite shoulder against the heavy wooden frame and twisted the iron key with all her limited, freezing strength. With a loud, sharp metallic crack that echoed loudly down the dark alley, the heavy internal mechanism finally gave way. The lock turned. Clara grabbed the ornate, deeply tarnished brass door handle and pushed. The heavy wooden door screamed on dry, rusted iron hinges and swung slowly open, releasing a massive, overwhelming wave of dark, stagnant air into the freezing rain. The immediate, incredibly powerful smell of the interior hit Clara like a heavy physical blow. It was an incredibly dense, highly complex olfactory history. The heavy, sharp scent of ancient dry rot in the wooden floorboards mixed intensely with the distinct, powdery smell of deeply decaying wool fabric, old cedar wood, and decades of completely undisturbed, stale dust. It was the distinct, unmistakable smell of a massive, sealed tomb. Clara pulled her small, cheap plastic flashlight from her wet jacket pocket and clicked it on. The weak yellow beam cut a narrow path through the incredibly thick, heavy darkness of the long, narrow room. She stepped cautiously over the heavy brass threshold, pulling the rotting wooden door firmly shut behind her. The loud, aggressive sound of the freezing rain outside was instantly muted, replaced by a profound, heavy, absolute silence that pressed deeply against her eardrum. She swept the weak flashlight beam slowly around the massive, narrow space. The shop was incredibly long, stretching deep into the dark space between the two massive brick factories. The highly elaborate interior architecture was breathtaking despite the severe, crushing decay. The walls were lined entirely with massive floor-to-ceiling mahogany display cabinets. The beautifully carved wood was heavily completely covered in a thick, grey shroud of undisturbed dust, and many of the delicate glass cabinet doors had shattered from decades of heavy structural settling, dumping thick shards of broken glass onto the wide plank hardwood floor. Clara walked slowly down the centre of the dark room, her wet boots crunching loudly on the broken glass and thick debris. In the centre of the shop sat an incredibly long, massive wooden cutting table. Its heavy, thick surface was deeply scarred with thousands of frantic, tiny cuts from old shears and sharp tracing wheels. Sitting completely silent and incredibly still on the heavy table were three massive antique Singer sewing machines. They were not the cheap, loud, rattling electric monsters of the modern industrial factory. They were incredibly heavy, beautiful machines made entirely of solid cast iron and highly polished steel powered by heavy cast iron foot treadles. They were gorgeous, functional pieces of heavy industrial art, now totally frozen solid by decades of deep rust. But it was the heavy, dark corners of the long room that truly unnerved her. Standing silently in the deep shadows were dozens of antique dress forms. They were life-sized, headless torsos built for draping heavy fabrics. Their internal structures were made of heavy, woven steel wire, covered tightly in thick, coarse canvas. The heavy canvas was deeply stained with decades of dark, oily fingerprints and heavily pin-pricked from thousands of sharp steel sewing needles. In the weak, flickering light of her small flashlight, the massive collection of headless, canvas torsos looked incredibly human, standing silently in the dark like an army of quiet, abandoned ghosts watching her highly intrusive arrival. Clara moved toward the back of the incredibly long, narrow shop. The heavy mahogany cabinets gave way to a small, slightly elevated back room, separated from the main floor by a heavy velvet curtain that completely disintegrated into fine, powdery dust the moment she touched it. This was the highly private fitting room and the main work area. The heavy ceiling back here had suffered massive, severe water damage. Large, dark chunks of heavy plaster had collapsed onto the floor, exposing the thick, dark wooden rafters above. She found a small, deeply recessed alcove near the back wall that was relatively dry and completely protected from the massive drafts. She dragged several large, relatively clean pieces of heavy, dry cardboard from a collapsed shipping box and laid them flat on the cold hardwood floor. She unrolled her incredibly thin, cheap sleeping bag, pulled her wet canvas jacket tight around her shivering shoulders, and sat heavily on the hard floor. She was completely surrounded by the heavy, crushing weight of severe physical decay. She had no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no heat. Her empty stomach cramped with a sharp, deep pain of aggressive hunger. She had exactly $11 left to her name. She turned off the weak flashlight to conserve the dying batteries, plunging the massive, deeply ruined dressmaker shop into absolute pitch-black darkness. The profound, heavy silence of the sealed room was incredibly isolating. She thought of the brutal, deafening roar of the heavy garment factory and the cruel, highly efficient way the massive manager had completely discarded. She squeezed her dark eyes shut, shivering violently in the bitter cold. A good seam will always hold tight, even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit. The sudden, unbidden thought flashed brightly through her exhausted mind, a desperate, irrational attempt to find a shred of meaning in her profound, freezing suffering. She buried her pale face in her cold hands, listening to the heavy, silent ghosts of the dress forms, and eventually fell into a deep, incredibly restless sleep. The first morning inside the ruined dressmaker shop was a brutal, incredibly harsh test of sheer physical endurance. As the grey, weak winter light slowly filtered through the heavy grime of the front plate glass window, the temperature inside the long, narrow room plummeted to near freezing. The thick brick walls on either side acted like massive, heavy ice blocks, radiating a deep, penetrating cold that cut directly through Clara's thin, damp clothing. She woke up violently shivering, her joints painfully stiff from sleeping on the incredibly hard hardwood floor. Her immediate, highly desperate priority was finding basic physical warmth. She pushed herself up from the dry cardboard and began to aggressively search the massive, ruined shop. She pulled open the heavy, sticking drawers of the dark mahogany display cabinet. Most were entirely empty, filled only with thick grey dust and the small dried husks of dead insects. But in the very bottom drawer of a massive cabinet near the front door, she found a highly valuable treasure: 3 massive, incredibly heavy bolts of thick, dark grey wool fabric. The heavy wool had been deeply forgotten for decades, but the incredibly dense natural fibres had completely resisted the deep rot that claimed the fragile cottons and silks. Clara dragged the heavy bolts to her small, isolated corner in the back room. She unrolled the thick, coarse fabric and aggressively wrapped multiple heavy layers tightly around her shivering body. The dense wool was incredibly scratchy against her skin, and it smelled intensely of stale dust and old mothballs, but it trapped her core body heat almost instantly. The violent shivering slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, heavy exhaustion. With the immediate threat of freezing temporarily mitigated, the intense, agonizing reality of her deep starvation aggressively demanded her attention. Her empty stomach cramped with a sharp, stabbing pain. She had absolutely no food, no running water, and only 11 single-dollar bills to her name. She knew she could easily walk back out into the freezing city and buy cheap food, but the deep, paralyzing fear of leaving her only secure shelter kept her firmly anchored inside the dark, heavy room. She needed to completely secure her small physical space before she could brave the terrifying outside world again. She spent the long, incredibly silent afternoon manually clearing the massive pile of heavy, collapsed plaster from the back-fitting room. The physical labor was intensely exhausting for her starving body. She used a piece of stiff, dry cardboard as a makeshift shovel, scooping the heavy, wet chunks of dark plaster and hauling them out the heavy rear wooden door, dumping the ruined debris into the narrow, freezing back alley. She aggressively swept the beautiful hardwood floor completely clean, exposing the intricate, highly detailed parquet wood patterns beneath decades of heavy dirt. As she aggressively cleared the deep corners of the back room, her weak flashlight beam swept across a solitary, deeply imposing figure, standing silently in the deepest, darkest shadow near the heavy brick wall. It was one of the antique dress forms. But this specific torso was fundamentally different from the dozens of other canvas figures scattered across the main shop floor. It was completely isolated, pushed heavily into the far corner, as if it had been deliberately hidden from casual view. Clara walked slowly toward the silent figure. The heavy dress form was mounted on an incredibly massive, ornate cast-iron base, significantly heavier and far more stable than the standard wooden tripods used on the other form. The thick, heavy canvas covering the torso was not the standard light beige color. It was a deeply stained, incredibly dark brown, heavily stiffened with age and perhaps an old applied resin. The shape of the torso was also highly unusual. It was not the standard, elegant hourglass figure used for draping delicate silk evening gowns. It was incredibly broad, thick and highly robust, designed for drafting heavy, thick wool winter coats or heavy men-s tailoring. She ran her pale, heavily calloused hand slowly over the stiff, dark canvas. The torso was incredibly hard and completely unyielding. She tapped the thick chest firmly with her knuckles. Instead of the hollow, resonant sound of an empty wire cage, the heavy dress form produced a dull, incredibly dense thud. Clara frowned in the deep gloom. A standard dressmaker S-form was completely hollow, relying entirely on a light wire skeleton to hold the canvas shape. It was explicitly designed to be lightweight and easily moved around the busy cutting room. This specific form was incredibly heavy, feeling almost completely solid. Her highly trained, deeply intuitive tailor's hands immediately sensed a profound, heavy structural anomaly beneath the thick fabric. She gripped at the heavy cast-iron base with both hands and tried to drag the heavy form out of the dark corner and into the weak grey light of the main room. The massive base barely moved. It weighed well over 100 pounds. Driven by a sudden intense curiosity that briefly overrode her deep hunger, Clara began to intensely examine the heavy canvas seams running down the sides of the dark torso. The heavy thread used to stitch the thick canvas together was incredibly thick and deeply embedded into the rigid fabric. The strange, unbidden thought echoed loudly in her mind again as she stared at the heavy stitches. She needed to see exactly what was hidden inside the massive wire cage. To breach the incredibly thick, highly stiffened canvas of the heavy form, Clara needed a highly specific tool. She walked back to the massive, deeply scarred wooden cutting table in the center of the main. She began aggressively opening the heavy, sticking wooden drawers beneath the thick table surface. She found old, rusted bobbins, brittle measuring tapes that snapped into dust when touched, and heavy, dull tracing wheels. Finally, in a deep, heavily recessed drawer near the back of the massive table, she found exactly what she desperately needed. Resting heavily on a bed of dry, rotted velvet was a massive pair of antique tailor's shears. They were made entirely of solid, high-carbon forged steel, incredibly heavy and deeply intimidating. The long, sharp blades were perfectly aligned, held together by a massive brass pivot screw. The heavy metal was completely black with age, but the incredibly sharp cutting edges were still pristine, perfectly protected inside the deep, dry drawer. Clara gripped the heavy steel handles. The massive shears felt incredibly familiar and deeply comforting in her highly trained hands. The heavy tool was a master instrument of the tailoring craft, designed specifically to cut flawlessly through thick, multiple layers of heavy wool and stiff canvas. She carried the heavy steel shears back to the dark corner where the massive dress form stood silently in the deep shadow. She positioned the incredibly sharp tip of the heavy steel blades directly at the base of the thick canvas neck, right at the heavy center seam running down the massive chest. The thick, dark canvas was incredibly rigid, almost like thin wood. She squeezed the heavy steel handles together with all her freezing, limited strength. The massive shears bit aggressively into the stiff fabric with a loud, incredibly satisfying crunch. She worked the heavy blades slowly and deliberately down the thick center seam, cutting violently through the heavy thread and the stiffened canvas. The physical effort was intensely exhausting, her weak arms burning with deep, heavy fatigue, but the sharp steel sliced cleanly through the tough barrier. When she finally reached the heavy cast-iron base, she stopped cutting. She gripped the two thick halves of the deeply severed canvas and pulled them forcefully apart, peeling the stiff fabric back to completely expose the heavy internal structure of the dark torso. The heavy wire cage beneath the canvas was completely unlike any standard dress form she had ever seen. Instead of thin, widely spaced wire designed simply to hold a hollow shape, the massive chest cavity was heavily reinforced with thick, overlapping bands of forged steel. It looked exactly like a highly secure, heavy iron rib cage. And resting securely inside that heavy steel cage, completely occupying the deep, hollow space of the massive torso, was a heavy, perfectly fitted square metal tin. Clara stopped breathing. The freezing air in the dark room suddenly felt incredibly thin. She reached her trembling, pale hands directly into the heavy steel ribcage and gripped the sides of the dark metal tin. It was tightly wedged into the thick wire frame, explicitly designed to fit perfectly and never rattle. She pulled hard, leveraging her weight against the massive cast-iron base. The heavy metal tin suddenly popped loose with a sharp metallic screech, sending Clara stumbling backward onto the cold hardwood floor. She sat quickly up, shining her weak, flickering flashlight directly onto the heavy object resting in her lap. It was a completely custom fabricated box, made of heavy, dark tin, completely sealed on all four sides with a thick, heavy layer of dark industrial wax. The incredibly dense box weighed at least 15 pounds. It was absolutely impenetrable without completely destroying the heavy wax seal. Her heart hammered a rapid, violent rhythm against her thin ribs. This massive, heavy tin had been deliberately, incredibly carefully hidden inside the heavy dress form decades ago. A highly skilled tailor had completely rebuilt the massive steel rib cage and tightly restitched the heavy canvas just to conceal this specific box. Clara grabbed the massive, heavy steel shears from the floor. She used the incredibly sharp, heavy tip of the long blade to aggressively gouge into the thick, dark wax sealing the tight lid. She chipped the hard wax away in large, heavy flakes, exposing the tight steel seam beneath. She wedged the flat tip of the heavy shear blade directly into the tight gap, and pried upward kepi tehat, violent, desperate force. The heavy tin lid popped completely off with a loud, sharp snap, clattering heavily onto the wooden floor. Clara aimed the weak yellow beam of her flashlight directly down into the deep, dark interior of the heavy metal box. What she saw completely paralyzed her exhausted mind, instantly freezing the breath in her painful lungs. The massive, crushing reality of her desperate, starving existence was about to violently, completely shatter in the dark, silent shock. Stacked incredibly neatly inside the heavy, dark tin box were dozens of incredibly thick, tight bundles of United States currency. The heavy paper bands securing the massive stacks were deeply yellowed and heavily fragile with extreme age, but the crisp, dark green bills underneath were absolutely pristine, completely protected from the brutal decay of the damp shop by the heavy, airtight wax seal. Clara's pale, trembling hands hovered hesitantly over the massive fortune. She could not force herself to touch the crisp paper, completely terrified that the massive stacks were a cruel, highly vivid hallucination born from her deep, agonizing starvation. She blinked her dark eyes rapidly, but the heavy, solid reality of the green money did not vanish into the freezing air. She slowly reached a single calloused finger down and touched the top bundle. The crisp, dense texture of the uncirculated bills was incredibly real. She pulled the first heavy bundle from the tight metal tin. It was a massive stack of crisp, perfectly flat $100 bills. She pulled another thick bundle, and another. The heavy stacks of cash piled up rapidly on her thin sleeping bag. Her freezing lips moved silently as she counted the incredibly fragile yellowed paper bands. Each thick band was heavily stamped with the exact amount. Hi, Kong Kong Kong. There were exactly 20 incredibly thick bundles packed tightly into the heavy tin. $40,000. Clara dropped the final heavy bundle onto the massive pile. A violent, massive shudder ripped completely through her entire thin body. She was a 21-year-old girl who had been aggressively fired from a brutal industrial factory DUET yesterday. She had exactly $11 left in her thin leather wallet. She had bought the entirely ruined, heavily condemned building for exactly $1 because she had nowhere else in the freezing world to go. And now, sitting heavily in her lap in the pitch-black darkness of a ruined fitting room, was a massive, staggering fortune. She stared blindly at the massive pile of heavy cash. The sheer, overwhelming magnitude of the sudden wealth was deeply terrifying. It completely shattered her rigid, highly desperate survival instincts. She didn't know whether to scream, or laugh, or aggressively run out into the freezing alley. But as her shaking hands moved back toward the deep tin box, her pale fingers brushed against something completely different resting flat at the very bottom. It was not more heavy currency. It was a thick, highly protected stack of incredibly delicate, heavy parchment paper, tightly wrapped in a protective layer of soft, dark muslin cloth. Clara carefully lifted the delicate, heavy package from the dark tin. She slowly unfolded the soft muslin cloth, revealing the thick stack of yellowed parchment. She aimed the weak, flickering beam of her flashlight directly at the heavy paper. They were massive, incredibly complex, entirely hand-drawn tailoring patterns. The incredibly intricate drafting lines were drawn in deep, heavy black ink, mapping out the highly complex architecture of beautiful, structured garments. Heavy wool winter coats, elegant, highly tailored suits, and complex, structured dresses. The mathematics of the intricate drafts were absolutely flawless, displaying a profound, highly masterful understanding of human anatomy and heavy fabric manipulation that Clara had never seen in her entire young life. Attached to the very top of the massive stack of beautiful patterns was a single, heavy sheet of thick stationery. The handwriting on the yellowed paper was incredibly sharp, elegant, and deeply precise, written with a heavy fountain pen. Clara leaned incredibly close to the weak flashlight beam, her dark eyes rapidly scanning the heavy, faded ink. The brutal, loud factories are aggressively taking over the entire world. They care absolutely nothing for the beautiful integrity of the heavy seam, only for the ruthless speed of the loud machine. Mott cannot compete with their massive Sehat-Pay volume, and my old tired hands can no longer pull the heavy thread. Mott, am forced to permanently close my beautiful shop. Clara traced the elegant, faded handwriting with her dirty, calloused finger. The profound, heavy heartbreak of the old master tailor resonated deeply and instantly in her own bruised, exhausted chest. Mottom hiding the entire savings of my long, dedicated life, exactly where the loud, mindless factory bosses will never ever look, deep inside the heavy wire heart of the craft they so deeply despise. If you have completely opened this thick canvas chest, you are not a scavenger. You are a true tailor. You understood the heavy structure. The $40,000 belongs entirely to you. Clara swallowed hard, her freezing throat completely tight. She looked down at the final, heavily underlined sentence on the thick paper. Do not let the loud, brutal machines completely destroy the beautiful craft. Rebuild the heavy tables. Thread the silent machines. Stitch the heavy fabric with deep, profound pride. Clara sat completely frozen in the dark, heavy room. The incredibly weak, dying beam of her small flashlight finally flickered and died completely, plunging the ruined dressmaker shop into absolute pitch-black darkness. But she did not panic. She sat quietly on the hard wooden floor, surrounded by $40,000 in heavy cash and the profound, masterful legacy of a dead tailor. The deep, agonizing starvation and the bitter, freezing cold suddenly felt completely irrelevant. The heavy, beautiful truth of the masteress' final words anchored her completely. She was no longer a discarded factory worker. She was the sole, fiercely proud owner of Eleanor S. Custom Dressmaker and Tailor. She closed her dark eyes, clutching the heavy parchment patterns tightly to her chest, ready to completely rebuild her massive life from the ruined. The freezing grey dawn broke slowly over the ruined industrial district, but Clara did not feel the biting chill. She woke up on the hard wooden floor of the back-fitting room with an incredibly fierce, powerful surge of pure adrenaline. The terrifying events of the previous night felt like a deeply vivid, impossible hallucination born of severe starvation. But when she pushed the heavy, scratchy wool fabric aside, the massive stacks of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills were still sitting heavily on the dry cardboard, a solid, undeniable mountain of immense wealth. She moved with rapid, highly focused energy. She carefully bundled the heavy stacks of cash back into the tight, custom-fitted dark metal tin. She placed the heavy tin securely back inside the thick steel ribcage of the antique dress form, pulling the stiff, dark canvas tightly over the massive opening to completely conceal the hidden fortune. She took exactly 2 crisp $100 bills from the top bundle, folded them into a tiny, incredibly tight square, and shoved them deep inside her freezing, muddy left boot. She pushed the heavy, rotting wooden door open and stepped out into the freezing, wet alleyway. The incredibly long, narrow shop was no longer a terrifying, massive graveyard of rotting wood and stale air. It was a massive, blank canvas waiting for heavy, brutal labor. She looked up at the towering brick factories pressing heavily on either side of her incredibly small property. She was no longer intimidated by their massive, crushing scale. She was entirely focused on her own desperate, immediate need. Clara walked rapidly out of the dark alley and into the busy early morning streets of the city. She ignored the sharp, biting pain in her completely empty stomach and the deep ache in her cramped, stiff muscle. She walked directly to a large commercial hardware store on the edge of the industrial district. She moved aggressively through the bright, sterile aisles. She loaded a massive heavy-duty metal shopping cart with a large high-output industrial space heater, 2 massive 5-gallon orange plastic buckets, heavy-duty chemical degrazers, a massive bundle of heavy shop rags, a powerful LED lantern, and a thick Sub-Zero rated sleeping bag. She pushed the heavy cart to the front counter. The older clerk looked incredibly skeptically at her filthy, soaked canvas jacket and her dirty, pale face. He rang up the massive pile of heavy equipment, clearly expecting her credit card to aggressively decline. Clara did not speak. She reached down into her dirty boot, retrieved the tight, folded square of crisp green paper, and slapped the heavy $100 bills flat on the glass counter. The clerk's eyes widened in profound shock, but he quickly made the change. She pushed the heavy overload metal cart directly to a small, brightly lit local grocery store. She filled 3 heavy plastic bags entirely with dense, high-calorie food, thick loaves of fresh bread, jars of heavy peanut butter, large blocks of sharp cheddar cheese, and several gallons of clean, bottled drinking water. The sheer physical exertion of pushing the massively heavy cart back through the flooded, freezing city streets was brutal, but she felt incredibly strong. The deep, agonizing starvation was finally officially ended. When she finally pushed the heavy cart back into the dark, freezing alleyway, she immediately hauled the heavy gear inside the ruin. She set up the massive, heavy-duty electric space heater in the small elevated back room and plugged it into a heavy extension cord she ran to a miraculously functional, ancient wall outlet. She flipped the heavy switch. The massive heater roared to life with a loud, aggressive hum, instantly flooding the freezing back room with an immense, overpowering wave of glorious, intense heat. Clara stripped off her filthy, completely soaked canvas jacket and her wet boots. She sat Deove Kepno heavily on the warm hardwood floor, directly in front of the roaring heater. She tore open a thick loaf of fresh bread and heavily sliced the sharp cheese. She ate the cold, rich food with a desperate, frantic aggression, the intense, satisfying flavors completely overwhelming her exhausted senses. It was the most incredible, satisfying meal of her entire life. The deep, painful cramps in her empty stomach slowly vanished entirely, replaced by a heavy, profound sense of physical warmth and intense satisfaction. She sat in the blazing heat of the back room, listening to the loud, aggressive roar of the space heater aggressively holding the freezing winter at bay. She looked out into the dark, incredibly long main shop floor. She had officially secured her basic physical survival. She was incredibly warm, completely full of heavy food, and deeply safe from the terrifying streets. The heavy, crushing desperation of the last 2 days was officially over. Tomorrow, the brutal, massive physical labor would truly begin. She would tackle the thick grime, the shattered glass, and the heavy, rusted cast iron. She smiled, a small, fierce grin in the warm light of the heater, and fell into a deep, uninterrupted, perfectly dreamless sleep. The massive, heavy physical restoration of Eleanor S., custom dressmaker and tailoring, began with the thick, completely opaque plate glass window at the front of the narrow shop. Clara stood in the freezing alleyway, wearing thick yellow rubber gloves and holding a heavy plastic bucket filled with scalding hot water and a harsh, aggressive chemical degreaser. She plunged a massive heavy bristle brush into the steaming bucket and violently attacked the thick, greasy layer of dark grey grime coating the heavy glass. The incredible physical effort required to break through 50 years of baked-on industrial soot was intense and punishing. She scrubbed Wer kept hat all her newly restored strength, her arm muscles burning with deep, heavy fatigue. The dark, thick sludge slowly began to streak and run down the massive pane, pooling on the cold cobblestones below. She aggressively wiped the heavy glass with thick, dry rags, pushing hard against the thick, immovable pane. As the heavy layers of thick dirt finally gave way, the incredible original beauty of the storefront was violently revealed. The faded, deeply peeling gold leaf lettering she had barely seen the day before was actually remarkably intact on the inside of the glass. Eleanor S. Custom Dressmaker and Tailoring. Est. Mochin Hi Hi. The highly elaborate, beautifully swirling script caught the weak, grey winter sunlight, gleaming warmly against the cold brick alley. More importantly, the massive, perfectly clean window allowed a massive flood of bright natural light to completely pour into the incredibly long dark shop for the very first time in 5 decades. Clara stepped back inside the shop and closed the heavy wooden door. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The incredibly long, narrow room was no longer a terrifying, pitch-black, tomb-filled Wer kept hat, dark, silent ghosts. It was a massive, highly detailed, beautifully proportioned workspace entirely bathed in soft, dusty grey natural light. She immediately turned her intense focus to the massive, highly ornate mahogany display cabinets lining the long brick walls. The beautiful carved dark wood was entirely suffocated under a thick grey shroud of undisturbed dust. She filled a new heavy bucket with warm water and gentle Murphy's oil soap. She spent the entire grueling day meticulously hand-washing the massive towering cabinet. She carefully removed the thick, heavy shards of broken glass from the damaged doors, wrapping them securely in thick cardboard for the heavy trash. As she aggressively scrubbed away the thick dust, the beautiful, incredibly rich, dark red tone of the antique mahogany slowly emerged, glowing deeply in the natural light. The highly complex, deeply carved floral motifs running along the heavy wooden cornices were absolutely masterful. She rubbed a heavy, thick layer of protective beeswax polished deeply into the thirsty, dry wood, completely restoring its original breathtaking luster. She moved to the incredibly long, massive wooden cutting table dominating the absolute center of the main shop floor. The heavy, thick surface was deeply, severely scarred from thousands of frantic, tiny cuts from old shears. Clara did not attempt to aggressively sand the deep scars away. She deeply respected the massive, heavy history etched entirely into the thick wood. She heavily scrubbed the massive table clean, then aggressively saturated the incredibly dry wood with thick, rich linseed oil, watching the heavy, thirsty grain eagerly drink the protective oil in seconds. The intense, punishing daily labor completely transformed her physical body. The deep, hollow starvation in her pale face was completely gone, replaced by a highly focused, healthy determination. Her thin, weak arms grew tight and highly defined with dense, hard muscle from constantly hauling heavy buckets of dirty water. Her pale hands were completely covered in deep, thick calluses from gripping the heavy bristle brushes. She was no longer running in blind terror from the crushing factory bosses. She was aggressively fighting to reclaim an incredible, deeply forgotten piece of tailoring history, heavily fueled by the hidden stacks of crisp $100 bills. The most terrifying, physically demanding challenge was entirely concentrated on the incredibly heavy, completely rusted cast iron sewing machines resting silently on the massive cutting table. They were antique, highly complex industrial Singer treadle machines. They were not powered by electricity. They required massive, constant physical leg power to spin the heavy iron flywheels. Decades of severe dampness had completely seized their intricate, complex internal gears into a solid, unmovable block of heavy orange rust. Clara completely disassembled the heavy machines, laying the intricate, heavily rusted steel parts out meticulously on clean white rags across the massive cutting table. She saturated the heavy, frozen iron gears with powerful, aggressive penetrating oil, letting the highly toxic chemicals aggressively eat through the thick rust overnight. The next morning, she aggressively attacked the heavy metal with thick, stiff wire brushes, violently scrubbing away the thick corrosion until the bare, bright steel finally shone through. She heavily lubricated the complex, intricate internal mechanisms with fresh, high-viscosity sewing machine oil. She reassembled the massive, incredibly heavy cast iron heads and mounted them securely back onto their heavy, ornate treadle bases. She sat on the heavy wooden stool, placed her boots firmly on the heavy iron treadle pedal, and pushed down with incredibly hard, rhythmic force. The heavy cast iron flywheel turned slowly at first, resisting slightly, then suddenly spun completely free. The intricate, highly complex needle bar flew up and down in a perfect, incredibly rapid, completely silent blur. There was no deafening, crushing mechanical roar like the massive factory. There was only the quiet, incredibly satisfying, highly precise clicking sound of flawlessly engineered steel operating in perfect harmony. Clara smiled, a deep, profound satisfaction swelling heavily in her chest. The silent machines were finally awake. With the massive mahogany cabinets gleaming deeply and the heavy cast-iron sewing machines fully operational, Clara turned her intense focus to the incredibly complex, highly fragile paper patterns left behind by the master tailor. She carried the thick, muslin-wrapped package from the dark, hidden tin and laid it extremely carefully on the clean, heavily oiled surface of the massive cutting table. She washed her calloused hands thoroughly, removing every single trace of heavy machine oil and dark grime. She dried them completely before gently unfolding the soft, dark muslin cloth. The incredibly thick, yellowed parchment paper was severely brittle, threatening to instantly crumble into fine dust if handled at any aggressive force. Clara spent an entire incredibly quiet week meticulously studying the massive, highly complex drafts. The beautiful, sweeping ink lines mapped out garments of incredible, profound structural integrity. There were heavy, thick wool winter coats designed to completely block the biting city wind, featuring incredibly complex, heavily reinforced internal canvas structures designed specifically to hold the precise shape of the heavy garment for decades. There were highly elegant, heavily tailored men's suits that required thousands of tiny, perfectly spaced hand stitches to expertly shape the stiff lapel. The profound, heavy realization hit her with absolute, striking clarity. The brutal, deafening industrial factory she had been violently fired from explicitly relied on cheap, weak polyester thread and incredibly rapid, careless machine stitching to quickly fuse weak fabrics together. The massive factory-produced garments designed explicitly to fail rapidly and be quickly discarded. But these incredibly complex, highly detailed paper patterns represented the exact, profound opposite philosophy. They were the absolute masterful pinnacle of enduring, highly structured tailoring. The master tailor who had drafted these complex lines believed deeply that a well-made garment was a permanent, highly protective piece of enduring architecture, not a cheap, temporary. Clara aggressively pulled the massive, incredibly heavy bolts of thick, dark grey wool she had found on her first freezing night out of the dark bottom drawer. She hoisted the incredibly heavy roll onto the massive cutting table. The thick, coarse wool was incredibly dense, weighing almost exactly like a heavy lead blanket. She unrolled 3 massive yards of the heavy fabric, smoothing it completely flat against the deeply scarred wool. She carefully laid the incredibly fragile, complex paper pattern pieces for the heavy winter coat perfectly onto the dark wool. She used heavy, solid brass pattern weights to hold the curling, brittle paper entirely flat. She picked up the incredibly heavy, freshly sharpened antique steel tailor shears. She gripped the heavy steel handles, took a deep, steadying breath, and cut aggressively into the thick, resistant fabric. The heavy steel blades sliced flawlessly through the thick wool with a deeply satisfying, incredibly rich snip. She cut the incredibly complex, highly precise pieces with absolute, focused perfection, honoring the exact, masterful lines drawn decades ago. She moved to the heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machine. She threaded the intricate bright steel mechanism with incredibly strong, highly durable, heavy-duty cotton thread. She aligned the incredibly thick, heavy pieces of dark wool under the heavy steel presser foot. She placed her boots firmly on the heavy iron treadle and began to pump her legs with a strong, completely steady, highly rhythmic motion. The heavy cast-iron machine hummed quietly, the incredibly sharp steel needle punching effortlessly and violently through the massive multiple layers of incredibly dense wool. She sewed the heavy primary seams with absolute, uncompromising precision, but the true, profound mastery of the complex coat required incredibly extensive, highly detailed handwork. Clara sat in the quiet, brightly lit shop for incredibly long hours, utilizing a sharp, heavy steel hand needle and a thick brass thimble. She expertly pad-stitched the highly complex internal canvas structure of the heavy lapels, taking thousands of tiny, incredibly precise, completely invisible stitches that permanently forced the stiff canvas and the heavy wool to roll together in a perfect, elegant, highly structured curve. She focused entirely on the absolute uncompromising integrity of every single tiny stitch. When she finally finished the massive, incredibly heavy winter coat, she hung it carefully on a thick, solid wooden hanger and placed it prominently on a heavy brass hook near the clean plate glass window. The incredibly heavy garment hung with profound, absolute authority. It was not a cheap, flimsy factory product. It was a massive, highly structured, deeply protective piece of incredibly enduring armor, built completely by hand to easily survive the most brutal, freezing city winter. She stood back and looked at her incredible, flawless creation, the deep, agonizing trauma of the loud, brutal factory, the terrifying eviction, and the freezing, desperate nights on the hard wooden floor felt completely, permanently stitched closed inside her. She had not just survived the heavy, crushing darkness, she had entirely reclaimed her deep, profound self-worth through the absolute, uncompromising mastery of the heavy The forgotten tailor shop was officially awake, and Clara was completely ready to open the heavy wooden door to the freezing city. On a bitterly cold, completely grey Monday morning in deep January, Clara finally unlocked the massive heavy brass deadbolt on the front door of Eleanor S. Custom Dressmaker and Tailoring. She pushed the heavy wooden door completely open, letting the freezing winter air mix intensely with the warm, rich smell of heavy wool, hot machine oil, and strong, dark coffee brewing in the warm back room. She stood quietly behind the incredibly long, massive mahogany cutting table, completely ready for the freezing. For the first 3 hours, absolutely no one entered the incredibly narrow shop. The massive, towering brick factories on either side buzzed loudly with aggressive, deafening industrial noise, completely ignoring the small, brightly lit storefront tucked deeply in the alleyway. But shortly before noon, the heavy wooden door creaked slowly open. An older man stepped incredibly hesitantly into the warm shop. He wore the thick, heavy boots and deeply stained canvas pants of a manual dock worker. His heavy shoulders were slumped with profound, deep physical exhaustion. He clutched an incredibly thick, heavily worn wool work coat tightly in his cold, dirty hand. Mott saw the bright light in the clean window, the old labourer said, his voice incredibly hoarse and deeply hesitant. Mott Canover kept this as a highly custom shop. Miss. Mott Donty have much cash. But this heavy coat is completely ruined, and Mott absolutely cannot survive the freezing docks without it. Clara walked out from behind the massive cutting table. She did not look at the man's dirty clothes or his empty wallet. She looked entirely at the heavy, ruined garment in his hands. She took the thick wool coat from him and laid it carefully flat on the heavy, oiled wood of the cutting table. The severe damage was massive. A huge, jagged tear ripped completely through the heavy wool of the right shoulder, exposing the thin, freezing inner lining. The heavy stress of lifting massive cargo crates had violently shredded the incredibly cheap, weak factory thread used in the original hasty construction. The brutal factories use incredibly thin cotton thread to sew these heavy winter coats, Clara said quietly, her expert hands aggressively examining the deep torn fibres. It is completely designed to aggressively fail under any heavy actual strain. Mort can easily fix this, sir. It will take exactly 1 hour. Please sit near the hot space heater in the back room. The old man sat heavily in the warm chair, completely shocked by the warm, highly respectful treatment. Clara did not take the ruined coat to the fast, heavy Singer treadle machine. A severe, jagged tear in thick wool required incredibly precise, heavy hand stitching to fully restore the complete structural integrity of the heavy garment. She threaded an incredibly sharp, heavy steel hand needle with thick, highly durable, heavy-duty linen thread that had been heavily coated in thick, protective beeswax. She sat under the bright, clear light of the front window. She expertly aligned the violently shredded edges of the thick. With incredible, fierce precision, she drove the heavy steel needle aggressively through the dense, resistant fabric. She did not execute a simple, weak, straight stitch. She used a highly complex, incredibly strong, interlocking heavy tailor S-stitch, pulling the incredibly thick linen thread violently tight after every single pass. The heavy beeswax melted slightly from the intense friction, permanently fusing the thick thread directly into the dense wool fibres. A good seam will always hold tight, even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit. She focused entirely on the absolute, uncompromising strength of the repair, heavily reinforcing the entire shoulder completely beyond its original, cheap factory specifications. When she handed the heavy coat back to the old labourer, he aggressively tested the massive repair. He pulled violently on the thick fabric they kept at both heavy, calloused hands. The heavy, interlocking seam did not yield a single millimetre. It was absolutely, profoundly unbreakable. "My God," the old man whispered, staring at the flawless, incredibly strong stitching. It's completely stronger than it was brand new. "How much do Mut heavily owe you?" "Miss?" $1, Clara said firmly, her dark eyes completely unyielding. A heavy coat should never fail a hard worker in the freezing dark. The old man stared at her in profound shock, slapped a wrinkled dollar bill on the heavy cutting table, and walked out into the freezing alley, completely protected by the heavy, flawless. Word of the incredible, unshakable repair spread rapidly and aggressively through the freezing, neglected industrial district. Within exactly 3 days, the small, narrow dressmaker S shop was completely packed. The massive, overwhelming influx of completely desperate freezing labourers transformed Eleanor S. custom dressmaker and tailoring into an incredibly vital, highly essential sanctuary in the dark alleyway. Clara worked with fierce, incredibly intense dedication from the early freezing grey dawn until long after the dark night fell. The heavy, ornate mahogany display cabinets were no longer empty. They were completely stacked verkepi hat heavy, torn wool coats, violently ripped canvas work pants, and entirely blown-out winter jackets. The massive, crushing industrial factories that surrounded her tiny shop aggressively discarded their exhausted workers, exactly like they discarded their cheap, poorly stitched garments. When a poor labourer S only heavy winter coat violently tore open, they could not afford a new one, leaving them completely, dangerously exposed to the brutal, freezing winter winds. Clara became their absolute fierce protector against the aggressive cold. She flatly refused to use the cheap, weak, incredibly rapid mending techniques forced upon her in the massive industrial factory. She treated every single ruined, dirty work coat with the exact same profound, masterful respect she would give to an incredibly expensive, highly tailored silk suit. She aggressively replaced completely shattered plastic zippers with kepi-to-hat heavy, massive, highly durable solid brass hardware. She heavily reinforced violently blown-out canvas knees with thick, impenetrable layers of incredibly dense leather. She relentlessly hand-stitched massively torn heavy wool seams using the incredibly thick, beeswax-coated heavy linen thread, permanently ensuring the violent tear would never ever fail again. And she charged them almost absolutely nothing, 50 cents to entirely replace a completely ruined collar, $1 to completely rebuild a massively shattered shoulder seam. The incredibly low prices did not even begin to cover the actual cost of the heavy, expensive materials she aggressively used, let alone her highly skilled, exhausting physical labor. But Clara did not care about generating a massive, aggressive profit. The incredibly dense, heavy tin box hidden securely inside the thick canvas chest of the antique dress form still held over $39,000 in crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. She fiercely, intentionally used the massive hidden fortune to heavily subsidize her incredible masterful labor. She was actively, aggressively returning the dead Master Tailor's hidden legacy directly to the freezing, desperate people who needed it the most. The $40,000 was not a lottery ticket. It was a heavy, profound obligation to aggressively stitch the broken, freezing community completely back together. The incredibly long, narrow shop was constantly filled with the loud, entirely warm chatter of exhausted men and women waiting for their heavy repairs. They sat on the clean, warm hardwood floor near the massive, roaring electric space heater, drinking hot, strong coffee Clara provided for free. They watched in profound, deep awe as she operated the massive, heavy cast-iron Singer treadle machine. The heavy, intricate metal flywheels spun in a rapid, incredibly smooth blur as her boots pumped the heavy iron pedals with powerful, completely steady rhythm. The sharp steel needles punching flawlessly through incredibly thick layers of heavy canvas and dense leather. One freezing Friday evening, just as Clara was preparing to lock the heavy brass deadbolt for the night, the heavy wooden door was pushed open aggressively. A young girl, completely soaked from the freezing rain, stumbled into the warm. She was fiercely clutching her own violently trembling arms, her face incredibly pale, her dark eyes completely wide with deep, paralyzing terror. Clara stopped wiping the massive mahogany cutting table. She recognized the young girl instantly. Her name was Maria. She was only 19 years old, and she had sat exactly 2 massive, loud industrial serger machines down from Clara on the brutal, deafening factory floor. Clara Maria sobbed violently, her voice cracking aggressively in the warm, quiet room. The floor manager fired me completely today. Mott was too incredibly slow. Mott couldn't hit the massive, crushing quota. Mott have absolutely no money. Mott have completely nowhere to go. Clara looked deeply at the terrified, completely broken young girl. She saw the exact, profound reflection of her own agonizing, freezing desperation from just months ago. A good seam will always hold tight, even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit. Clara walked aggressively out from behind the heavy cutting table. She grabbed a thick, incredibly warm, entirely custom-made heavy wool coat from the mahogany cabinet and aggressively wrapped it tightly around Maria's shivering, soaking wet shoulders. "You are completely safe here," Clara said, with absolute, unyielding, fierce authority. "You will never ever step foot inside that massive, brutal factory again. Tomorrow morning you are going to sit at the heavy cast-iron Singer treadle machine. Mottam going to actively teach you how to execute an absolutely flawless, completely unbreakable heavy seam. We have a massive pile of heavy winter coats that need to be aggressively saved from the freezing mud. The intense, highly demanding apprenticeship of young Maria began at exactly 6 o'clock the very next freezing morning. Clara did not place the terrified, exhausted girl at the massive, heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machine. True, profound tailoring did not begin with the rapid mechanical speed of spinning steel gears. It began entirely with the slow, incredibly deliberate, highly precise mastery of the heavy hand needle. Clara sat Maria down at the massive, beautifully scarred mahogany cutting table under the bright, clear light of the clean front window. She handed the young girl a heavy, thick square of stiff, highly resistant canvas and a long, incredibly sharp steel hand needle threaded with thick, heavy linen thread. The massive, brutal factory taught you to fiercely hate the heavy fabric, Clara said, her voice deeply calm but incredibly firm. They aggressively forced you to violently shove cheap polyester through loud, screaming machines as fast as physically possible. You must completely unlearn that violent, panicked aggression. You must actively feel the heavy tension of the strong weave. You must profoundly respect the thick fibers. For the incredibly frustrating, deeply exhausting first 2 weeks, Maria did absolutely nothing but execute thousands of tiny, completely straight-running stitches entirely by hand. Her fingers, trained completely for the frantic speed of the electric serger, cramped violently with deep, painful spasms. The incredibly thick canvas aggressively resisted the sharp steel needle, forcing her to push with massive, frustrating effort. She cried frequently, completely overwhelmed by the profound, incredibly slow difficulty of the massive task. But Clara was absolutely, fiercely unrelenting. She sat directly beside the young girl, aggressively guiding her shaking hands, entirely refusing to accept a single uneven, careless stitch. A good seam will always hold tight, even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit. She aggressively forced Maria to violently rip out hundreds of weak, sloppy stitches and do the heavy, tedious work completely over again. A bad, careless stitch is a massive, permanent insult to the exhausted worker who has to rely entirely on this heavy coat to survive the freezing dark, Clara demanded fiercely, directly echoing her own profoundly angry words to the massive factory manager. "We are not manufacturing cheap, disposable trash. We are actively stitching their survival completely back together. Do it again. Perfectly." Slowly, the profound, incredibly heavy discipline began to fundamentally transform the broken young girl. The frantic, terrified panic completely left Maria's dark eyes, replaced by a deep, highly focused, incredibly intense concentration. Her weak hands grew entirely strong and deeply calloused. She began to actively understand the profound, beautiful mathematics of the heavy thread pulling perfectly tight against the dense fabric. When Maria finally proved she could execute an absolutely flawless, completely unbreakable heavy seam by hand, Clara officially moved her to the incredibly heavy antique cast-iron Singer treadle machine. The transition from the massive, deafening electric factory machines to the completely silent, entirely foot-powered antique was deeply jarring. "You completely control the precise speed with your heavy boots," Clara instructed, standing behind the massive iron machine. "If you panic and pump aggressively, the heavy iron flywheel will spin violently out of control and snap the heavy steel needle instantly. You must find the completely steady, perfect rhythm. The heavy machine is not your aggressive master, it is your completely silent partner." Maria placed her boots firmly on the incredibly heavy, ornate, cast-iron pedal. She pushed down hesitantly. The heavy flywheel resisted, then turned slowly. She found the heavy, rhythmic momentum. The incredibly sharp steel needle began to punch flawlessly and completely silently through the thick layers of heavy, dark wool. There was no deafening mechanical roar, only the deeply satisfying, highly precise metallic clicking of perfectly maintained antique steel. Maria smiled. A huge, incredibly genuine expression of absolute, profound joy breaking across her young face. She was completely, entirely free from the crushing, terrifying quota She was actively creating something enduring, deeply strong, and highly protective. Clara stood back and watched the young girl operate the massive iron machine with growing fierce confidence. She looked deep into the dark shadows of the long room, toward the highly unusual heavy canvas dress form, mounted securely on the massive cast iron base. The incredibly thick canvas chest was heavily stitched, completely closed again, fully hiding the remaining $30-something thousand in heavy cash. The dead master tailoress legacy was no longer just a pile of crisp paper money hidden in the dark. It was fiercely, actively alive, loudly singing through the spinning iron flywheels and the heavily calloused hands of two deeply resilient girls who entirely refused to be aggressively discarded by a brutal world. As the brutal, freezing winter raged aggressively outside, the incredibly vital, warm reputation of Eleanor S., custom dressmaker and tailoring, spread massively beyond the desperate poor labourers. The incredibly strong, completely unbreakable nature of Clara's heavy mending eventually caught the direct, aggressive attention of the massive industrial factory boss. They noticed that their exhausted workers were suddenly no longer freezing to death on the heavy loading docks, wearing heavily reinforced winter coats that completely defied the massive, cheap wear and tear of the brutal factory floor. One highly freezing Tuesday afternoon, the incredibly heavy wooden door of the small shop was aggressively pushed open. A massive, heavily dressed man stepped into the warm room. He wore an incredibly expensive, highly tailored long wool overcoat and a thick, rich silk scarf. He was not a freezing, desperate labourer. He was the chief operations director of the massive, deafening steel mill, located directly at the far end of the dark industrial district. He walked aggressively past the long line of tired, freezing workers waiting patiently for their heavy repairs. He completely ignored Maria, who was operating the silent cast-iron Singer treadle machine with deep, rhythmic focus. He marched directly to the incredibly long, massive mahogany cutting table where Clara was meticulously executing a highly complex, heavy pad stitch by hand. Mort V. seen the incredibly heavy, completely unbreakable repairs you are doing on these cheap factory coats, the massive director said, his loud, aggressive voice completely shattering the quiet, focused peace of the small. Your highly durable hand stitching is incredibly impressive. The cheap factory coats Mott buy for my massive crew violently tear apart in exactly 3 weeks. Mott am heavily tired of replacing them. Clara did not stop her precise, tiny hand stitches. She did not look up from the heavy dark wool. What exactly do you want? Sir? She asked, her voice deeply cold and entirely flat. Mort want to offer you a massive, incredibly lucrative commercial contract, the director declared aggressively, pulling a thick, heavy leather checkbook from his expensive coat. Mott want you to completely manufacture 500 incredibly heavy, deeply reinforced wool winter coats for my entire massive crew. Mott will pay you incredibly well. You can finally buy massive, loud electric machines, hire dozens of cheap girls, and completely escape this tiny, ruined alleyway. Clara finally stopped her sharp steel needle. She looked slowly up at the massive, wealthy industrial boss. She looked at his deeply greedy, highly aggressive eyes. She instantly recognized the exact, profound, crushing trap that had completely destroyed the old master tailor decades ago. The massive director did not care about the beautiful integrity of the heavy seam. He only cared about exploiting her incredible, masterful skill to aggressively increase the ruthless efficiency of his massive, loud factory. The brutal, loud factories are aggressively taking over the entire world. They care absolutely nothing for the beautiful integrity of the heavy seam, only for the ruthless speed of the loud machine. The dead master's profound, heavily inked words echoed loudly and fiercely in Clara's entirely calm mind. No, Clara said with absolute, fierce, unyielding authority. The massive director blinked, completely shocked by the immediate flat refusal. What do you mean, no? Mott am offering you a massive fortune. You are currently charging these completely broke laborers exactly $1 for incredibly heavy hours-long repairs. You are completely failing as a business. Mortem, not a massive, loud industrial factory, Clara said, standing up aggressively and leaning heavily over the massive, deeply scarred mahogany cutting table. Mott absolutely refused to completely compromise the profound, beautiful integrity of the heavy thread to hit your massive, aggressive quota. Mott will not violently shove cheap fabric through screaming electric machines just to make you incredibly rich. Mott hand-stitch heavy coats so that these freezing men do not completely die on your brutal docks. My highly skilled labor is absolutely not for massive commercial sale. The wealthy director stared at the fierce, incredibly unyielding 21-year-old girl in profound, angry disbelief. He snapped his heavy leather checkbook shut with a loud, aggressive crack. "You are incredibly foolish," he sneered aggressively. "This tiny, ruined shop will completely collapse into the freezing mud by next winter. You cannot survive fighting the massive modern world with slow, antique hand needles." He turned aggressively and stormed out of the warm shop, slamming the heavy wooden door violently behind him. The loud noise echoed sharply in the quiet room. Maria stopped pumping the heavy cast-iron treadle. She looked at Clara with wide, completely shocked dark eyes. He was offering you a massive, incredible amount of heavy cash. Clara, you could have easily been completely rich. Clara sat calmly back down under the bright, clear light of the front window. She picked up her heavy steel hand needle and immediately resumed her flawless, highly complex pad stitching. "We are already incredibly rich, Maria," Clara said softly, a deep, profound peace settling heavily over her completely exhausted face. "A good seam will always hold tight even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit. We absolutely never compromise the heavy thread. Call the next freezing worker. His heavy coat desperately needs our complete attention." When the freezing, brutal Pennsylvania winter finally broke into a heavily damp, cool spring, the incredibly small, narrow dressmaker shop was fundamentally, profoundly established as the absolute, vital heart of the neglected industrial district. The massive, towering brick factories still roared with deafening, aggressive noise, but the quiet, incredibly warm storefront in the dark alleyway provided a massive, unshakable sanctuary of profound dignity and heavy, enduring strength for the completely exhausted workers. Clara had aggressively utilized a significant portion of the massive hidden cash to permanently secure the physical reality of the ruined building. She hired an incredibly skilled, heavy commercial structural team to completely tear off the rotting, deeply compromised timber roof. They aggressively installed massive, heavy-duty steel I-beams and a thick, completely seamless waterproof membrane, permanently ensuring that the heavy crushing liability she had purchased for $1 would absolutely never collapse. She completely rewired the highly dangerous electrical system, replacing the ancient frayed cloth wires with heavy thick copper. The small shop was no longer a terrifying, highly dangerous tomb. It was a massively strong, permanently fortified fortress of heavy tailoring. One quiet, entirely slow Sunday afternoon, Clara locked the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door. The massive shop was completely silent, filled only with the soft, dusty grey light filtering through the massive, perfectly clean front window. She walked to the back fitting room where Maria was aggressively sweeping the beautiful hardwood floors clean of heavy thread clippings and thick canvas dust. "Maria," Clara said quietly, her voice echoing softly in the incredibly long, narrow room. "Come here. Mott need to show you something incredibly important." Maria leaned the heavy broom against the dark mahogany cabinet and walked over to Clara, who was standing deeply in the dark back corner. She was standing directly next to the highly unusual, incredibly heavy canvas dress form mounted securely on the massive cast-iron base. Clara picked up the massive, incredibly heavy antique steel tailor shears from the cutting table. Without a single word of explanation, she plunged the incredibly sharp tip directly into the heavy dark center seam of the thick canvas chest. Maria gasped loudly in profound shock as Clara aggressively cut the thick, heavy fabric completely open, violently exposing the heavy, thick steel wire ribcage beneath. "Clara, what are you doing?" Maria asked, her voice completely frantic. "That heavy dress form is an incredible antique." Clara did not answer. She reached her heavily calloused hands directly into the massive steel ribcage and pulled out the heavy, dark, custom-fitted metal tin. She set the heavy box carefully on the hardwood floor and easily popped the heavy lid open. Maria stared down into the heavy tin. The massive, thick bundles of crisp, uncirculated $100 bills were stacked incredibly neatly next to the thick, soft muslin cloth holding the fragile paper pattern. The young girl completely stopped breathing, her dark eyes wide with profound, terrified disbelief. This massive fortune was hidden entirely inside the heavy wire cage by the dead master tailor who owned this beautiful shop decades ago, Clara explained, her voice incredibly calm and deeply resonant. "Mott found it on my incredibly desperate, starving second night here. The heavy cash is exactly how Mott survived. It is exactly how Mott bought the heavy space heaters, the incredibly expensive marine-grade white paint for the ceiling, and the massive steel beams for the new roof. It is entirely how we can afford to aggressively charge the freezing laborers almost nothing for incredibly heavy, hours-long repairs." Maria slowly reached down and touched the crisp, yellowed paper band on a massive bundle of cash. "It says an incredible fortune. Why didn't you aggressively take the massive money and completely leave this dark, freezing alleyway? You could have bought a beautiful, warm house anywhere." Clara looked deeply into the young girl's entirely shocked face, because the incredibly heavy money came with a profound absolute contract. The dead tailor aggressively demanded that the beautiful, enduring craft not be completely destroyed by the loud, brutal machines. Mott was violently discarded by those exact same massive factories. So were you. We were completely broken, starving, and entirely lost. This massive dirt and these silent, beautiful machines are our absolute salvation. Clara reached into the heavy tin and gently lifted the incredibly fragile, yellowed paper patterns wrapped securely in the soft muslin. "A good seam will always hold tight, even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit," Clara said, fiercely echoing the profound, heavy truth that had completely anchored her desperate survival. "We do not run from the massive ruins, we aggressively rebuild them. We do the incredibly heavy, slow labor so that the desperate people outside have a massive, strong shield against the freezing dark. This heavy fortune does not belong to us. We are just its fierce, heavily calloused guardians." Maria looked deeply at Moff the heavy cash, then up at the towering, silent dress forms, and finally at Clara's strong, entirely unyielding face. The deep, agonizing cycle of terrified poverty and brutal industrial exploitation had been aggressively, permanently broken in this small room. Maria nodded slowly, a profound, fierce understanding settling heavily over her young face. She was completely ready to carry the massive, heavy legacy forward. The massive, heavy legacy of the dead master tailor was not just fiercely protected, it was actively, aggressively expanded by the two deeply resilient young women. As the years slowly passed, Eleanor's custom dressmaker and tailoring became an absolutely legendary, unshakable institution within the completely transformed industrial district. The massive, towering brick factories around them eventually failed, their deafening, brutal machines completely silenced by changing economic tides. The massive brick warehouses were slowly converted into expensive, highly sterile loft apartments and trendy, loud coffee shops. But the incredibly small, narrow storefront squeezed tightly between the massive brick walls remained absolutely, completely unchanged. The beautifully carved, deep mahogany display cabinets still gleamed warmly, their kepite hat thick beeswax. The massive, heavily scarred wooden cutting table still dominated the absolute centre of the long room, and the incredibly heavy antique cast-iron Singer sewing machine still hummed with completely silent, deeply powerful, flawless precision. Clara and Maria fiercely refused to ever modernise their incredible craft. They never bought loud, aggressive electric sergers. They never used cheap, weak polyester thread. They continued to meticulously hand-draft highly complex, beautifully structured paper patterns, relying entirely on the profound, masterful mathematics left behind in the hidden tin box. They aggressively hand-stitched every single heavy lapel, permanently ensuring that every heavy coat they produced was an incredible, enduring piece of deeply protective art. The massive, hidden fortune of crisp $100 bills was eventually completely depleted, but the heavy, deeply subsidized repairs for the poor laborers had successfully built an incredibly massive, intensely loyal client base. The shop was incredibly profitable on its own, generating a highly secure, deeply comfortable living for both women. They had successfully stitched their incredibly broken, freezing lives completely back together, forming a massive, unbreakable bond forged entirely in the terrifying crucible of deep starvation and heavy, brutal labor. One completely quiet, deeply grey winter afternoon, exactly like the terrifying day she had first bought the massive liability for $1, Clara stood entirely alone in the warm, bright back room. She was now a deeply respected, highly masterful woman in her early 30s. Her pale hands were completely, permanently scarred with thousands of tiny, deep needle pricks, the incredibly proud, visible badges of her absolute, uncompromising devotion to the heavy thread. She walked over to the highly unusual, incredibly heavy canvased dress form standing silently in the dark corner. The massive steel ribcage was currently completely empty, the dark metal tin entirely devoid of heavy cap. But the heavy, ornate cast-iron base still securely anchored the imposing figure to the hardwood floor. Clara reached into the deep pocket of her thick, custom-made wool trousers. She pulled out a small, highly polished brass plaque she had custom-ordered from a heavy metal engraver. She carefully applied a thick layer of incredibly strong industrial-grade epoxy to the back of the heavy metal rectangle. She pressed the cold brass firmly against the dark, heavy cast-iron base of the antique dress form, holding it deeply secure until the aggressive adhesive cured completely. When she stepped back, the bright brass gleamed warmly under the soft natural light. The deeply engraved, incredibly sharp black lettering was simple, profound, and permanently enduring. For the master who trusted the dark wire. The heavy seam still holds tight here. She ran her deeply calloused thumb over the sharp engraving. She had never known the old master tailor's actual name. She only knew the profound, crushing depth of his desperate love for the beautiful, slow craft and the fierce, incredibly risky trust he had placed in a total, starving stranger. He had completely saved the ruined shop from beyond the grave, using the desperate, freezing hands of a 21-year-old fired factory girl to perfectly execute his final heavy will. Clara turned away from the silent, heavy dress form and walked back to the massive, deeply scarred mahogany cutting table. Maria was actively unrolling a massive, incredibly heavy bolt of dark blue wool, her strong hands moving with deeply confident, absolute mastery. The shop was warm, highly secure, and deeply alive. The heavy, crushing terror of the brutal, deafening factory floor was completely, permanently gone. A good seam will always hold tight, even when the fabric is stretched to its absolute limit. Clara smiled, a deep, profound expression of absolute, unshakable peace settling entirely over her strong face. She picked up her massive, incredibly heavy antique steel shears. She gripped the cold steel handles with immense fierce pride, completely ready to cut the thick fabric and forcefully begin the slow, incredibly beautiful process of building a massive, highly protective shield against the freezing dark. The heavy thread would never, ever break. The profound, incredibly enduring legacy of Eleanor custom dressmaker and tailoring slowly began to deeply permeate the entire rapidly changing city. As the years turned into a full decade, the massive, aggressive industrial factories that had once violently dominated the district were entirely gone. The deafening, crushing mechanical roar was replaced by the quiet, sterile hum of modern technology and expensive residential lofts. But the incredibly small, narrow shop squeezed tightly between the massive brick walls remained absolutely, fiercely defiant, a perfectly preserved, highly active fortress of the old slow craft. The heavy, incredibly thick wool winter coats that Clara and Maria had meticulously hand-stitched for the desperate freezing labourers years ago became legendary objects within the local community. Long after the exhausted dock workers had finally retired, their heavy coats remained completely fundamentally intact. The dense wool showed deep signs of heavy wear, but the incredibly precise, massive hand-sewn seams never, ever failed. They were passed down aggressively from fathers to sons, highly treasured, deeply protective garments that completely defied the modern, cheap culture of rapid disposal. One crisp, clear autumn afternoon, the heavy wooden door of the shop opened slowly. A highly educated, sharply dressed woman stepped into the warm room. She was not a freezing labourer, nor was she an aggressive, greedy factory boss. She was the chief curator for the city's massive, highly funded Museum of Industrial History and Regional Textiles. She walked slowly past the heavy, polished mahogany display cabinets, her eyes wide with profound, deep awe. She stopped at the massive, heavily scarred wooden cutting table and watched Clara execute an incredibly complex, perfectly aligned heavy buttonhole entirely by hand using incredibly thick, dark silk thread. Mort have spent the last 3 years aggressively studying the history of the local garment industry, the curator said, her voice completely hushed, vekepite heart intense respect. Mort have seen thousands of cheap, failing factory garments from this exact district, but Mott have recently encountered several incredibly heavy, masterfully constructed winter coats that completely defy all known industrial manufacturing techniques. They are entirely hand-stitched with profound, absolute structural integrity. The owners proudly told me they were heavily built entirely in this tiny narrow alleyway. Clara did not stop her precise, tiny needle. She simply nodded. We do not use the loud, rapid electric machines. We strictly use the heavy, cast-iron Singer treadles, and we heavily reinforce every critical stress point entirely by hand. It is absolutely masterful, the curator breathed, staring deeply at the incredibly heavy antique dress forms standing silently in the shadows. The museum is completely opening a massive new permanent exhibit, dedicated entirely to enduring regional craftsmanship. We desperately want to heavily feature your incredible work. We want to completely purchase one of your brand new, heavy wool winter coats to prominently display in the massive central glass case. Clara slowly tied off the incredibly thick silk thread and snipped it cleanly with her massive, heavy antique steel shears. She looked directly at the curator, her dark eyes completely unyielding. No, Clara said firmly. My brand new heavy coats are aggressively designed specifically to protect living, breathing people from the freezing city winds. They are not dead, static art pieces meant to be completely locked away in sterile glass boxes. They need to be heavily worn. They need to actively fight the cold. The curator looked deeply disappointed. her shoulders slumping slightly. "Mort completely understand your fierce dedication to the function, but it is a massive, profound tragedy that the wider world cannot see this incredible, beautiful level of deep mastery." Clara stood up and walked over to a dark mahogany cabinet near the back-fitting room. She reached deep inside and pulled out a heavily worn, incredibly thick wool work coat. It was the exact original coat she had repaired for the old, exhausted dock worker on her very first day of public operation. When the old man had finally retired years later, he had tearfully returned the heavy coat to Clara, explicitly wanting the fiercely protective garment to rest safely in the warm shop that had completely saved him. The heavy coat was deeply faded, heavily stained with dark oil and city dirt, but the incredible, massive hand-stitched repair on the right shoulder was completely pristine. The thick, beeswax-coated linen thread holding the dense wool together with absolute, aggressive perfection. "You cannot buy a new coat to lock in a glass box," Clara said quietly, holding the heavy, deeply historical garment out to the shocked curator. "But Mott will permanently loan you this specific coat. It completely tells the absolute profound truth about this small shop. It shows exactly why we fiercely refuse the loud machines. It shows the brutal wear, and it heavily displays the absolute unbreakable strength of the repair." The curator took the heavy, dense wool coat with incredibly profound, deep reverence. "It is absolutely magnificent. It perfectly embodies the absolute endurance of the heavy craft." Clara smiled, a deep, highly satisfied expression settling over her strong face. The legacy of the dead master tailor was no longer just aggressively hiding in the dark tin box. It was officially, permanently recognized as a massive, enduring pillar of the city's history. The museum would loudly tell the wider world exactly what Clara had always deeply known. The heavy thread completely survives the massive, crushing factory. The massive, highly publicized museum exhibit brought an entirely new, incredibly overwhelming wave of massive attention to Eleanor S. custom dressmaker and tailoring. Wealthy clients from the pristine, expensive residential districts suddenly began arriving at the narrow, dark alleyway, aggressively requesting custom, heavily tailored garments and offering massive, highly inflated sums of crisp cash. But Clara and Maria fiercely, absolutely refused to fundamentally change the profound, deep core of their operation. They did not aggressively raise their incredibly low prices. They did not hire a massive staff of cheap labor to rapidly increase their slow, methodical output. And they absolutely, unapologetically prioritized the heavy mending needs of the local working-class neighborhood over the highly lucrative, completely frivolous demands of the wealthy elite. If a massive, rich client wanted a custom wool coat, they were firmly placed on an incredibly long 2-year waiting list, strictly behind the immediate, desperate repairs of the exhausted people who actually lived in the freezing cold. As the quiet, heavily structured years continued to pass, the profound cycle of deep healing that Clara had aggressively initiated began to rapidly, beautifully multiply. Maria, the terrified, starving young girl who had stumbled into the shop years ago, was now an incredibly masterful, highly confident woman in her late 20s. Her hands were exactly as heavily calloused and deeply skilled as Clara S. One fiercely cold grey November morning, Maria unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt on the front door. Sitting huddled aggressively against the cold brick wall in the narrow alleyway was a young girl, no older than 18. She was incredibly thin, shivering violently in a severely torn, completely inadequate thin cotton jacket. Her dark eyes were completely wide with deep, paralyzing terror and profound, agonizing exhaustion. Maria completely stopped breathing. She stared deeply at the freezing girl, instantly seeing the exact, terrifying reflection of her own desperate, starving past. The massive, Brutal city was still aggressively discarding vulnerable people into the freezing mud. Maria did not hesitate for a single second. She reached out, grabbed the freezing girl gently by her shivering arm, and pulled her aggressively into the warm, bright shore. She sat the terrified girl down directly in front of the massive roaring space heater and handed her a thick, heavy mug of scalding hot coffee. "You are completely safe here," Maria said, her voice deeply resonant with absolute fierce authority, exactly echoing the profound words Clara had spoken to her a decade ago. "You are never going back out into that freezing, terrifying street. After you are completely warm, I'm going to sit you down at that massive, deeply scarred wooden cutting table. I'm going to actively teach you how to execute an absolutely flawless, completely unbreakable heavy seam." Clara watched quietly from the back fitting room, leaning heavily against the dark mahogany cabinet. She saw Maria fiercely wrap a thick, heavy custom-made wool coat tightly around the young girl's shivering shoulders. She watched the profound, incredibly heavy legacy of the craft aggressively pass forward to the third desperate generation. The small, incredibly narrow dressmaker shop was no longer just a business. It was a deeply fortified, highly active, multi-generational fortress of incredibly strong, resilient women who fiercely respected the heavy thread. The antique, heavy cast-iron Singer sewing machines continued to hum flawlessly and completely silently, driven entirely by the highly focused rhythmic leg power of women who entirely refused to be crushed by a brutal world. The heavy, dark metal tin hidden deeply inside the massive wire ribcage of the antique dress form was completely, permanently empty. The $40,000 in crisp, uncirculated $100 bills had been entirely spent on heavy steel roof beams, thick marine paint, heavy commercial space heaters, and decades of heavily subsidized, deeply protective repairs for the poorest laborers in the massive city. But Clara did not deeply mourn the massive loss of the hidden cash. The heavy physical money was never the true profound treasure. The true absolute wealth was the massive enduring survival of the beautiful craft itself. The profound heavy ability to aggressively take broken, shredded, completely ruined materials and violently, meticulously stitch them completely back together into a massively strong, highly protective shield. Clara walked slowly over to the massive, heavily scarred mahogany cutting table. She ran her deeply calloused hand lovingly over the heavy oiled wood. She looked out the perfectly clean, massive plate glass window at the cold grey alleyway. She had completely survived the freezing. She had aggressively built an incredible, permanent home out of the ruined dirt. The massive, beautiful truth anchored her entirely. The heavy thread had completely saved her life, and she would fiercely, proudly ensure it continued to save many, many more. The deeply serene, highly focused environment of Eleanor S. custom dressmaker and tailoring stood in massive, stark contrast to the rapidly accelerating, highly digital modern world actively exploding outside the narrow alleyway. While massive corporate fashion brands aggressively chased fleeting, cheap trends utilizing massive overseas factories, the incredibly small shop resolutely doubled down on extreme, slow permanence. Clara, now approaching her mid-40s, had achieved the absolute masterful pinnacle of the tailoring craft. She moved around the massive, deeply scarred mahogany cutting table with an incredibly slow, deliberate, highly efficient grace that only comes from decades of intense, unbroken repetition. Her deeply calloused hands possessed a profound, almost terrifying intuitive knowledge of how heavy fabrics would physically behave under extreme stress. She could blindly run her rough fingers over a massive bolt of heavy wool and instantly determine exactly how many dense layers of internal canvas were explicitly required to permanently support the complex lapel. The young apprentice that Maria had aggressively pulled from the freezing alleyway, a quiet, fiercely determined girl named Elena, had fully blossomed under the intense, heavy discipline of Elena now flawlessly operated the massive, heavy cast-iron Singer treadle machines with deep rhythmic perfection. The tiny, narrow room was constantly filled with the incredibly satisfying, completely silent clicking of the heavy steel mechanisms, punctuated only by the sharp, heavy snip of the massive antique tailor shears cutting through dense wool. They operated as a highly cohesive, deeply silent, incredibly efficient family unit. They did not need to shout aggressive orders like the massive factory bosses. A simple, quiet nod or a sharp glance was completely sufficient to communicate incredibly complex, highly technical tailoring adjustments. They were fiercely bound together by the heavy shared trauma of their desperate pasts and the profound absolute salvation they had all found in the heavy. One quiet, deeply rainy afternoon, Clara sat entirely alone at the massive cutting table, working on a highly complex, incredibly heavy winter coat for an old retired neighborhood grocer. She expertly pushed the incredibly sharp, heavy steel hand needle through the dense layers of thick wool and stiff canvas, pulling the thick, beeswax-coated linen thread perfectly tight. She paused her rhythmic, highly precise stitching and looked deeply around the incredibly long, narrow room. The beautiful, massive mahogany display cabinets glowed warmly in the soft grey light filtering through the massive plate glass window. The incredibly heavy, thick timber roof above her head was absolutely solid, completely preventing the aggressive, freezing rain from entering her warm sanctuary. She looked deeply into the dark back corner of the shop, where the highly unusual, incredibly heavy canvas dress form stood silently on its massive cast-iron base. The highly polished brass plaque she had securely epoxied there years ago gleamed brightly. For the master who trusted the dark wire. The heavy seam still holds tight here. Clara closed her dark eyes, letting the profound, heavy memories wash entirely over her. She vividly remembered the intense, deafening, crushing roar of the massive industrial factory that had violently fired her. She remembered the sheer, paralyzing terror of wandering the freezing, flooded streets. Vekepitahat exactly $12 to her entire name. She vividly recalled the profound, agonizing physical starvation that had fiercely gripped her empty stomach during her first 3 terrifying nights sleeping on the cold, hardwood floor. And she deeply remembered the massive, overwhelming shock of ripping open the thick, heavily stiffened canvas chest of the antique dress form to discover the heavy, dark metal tin filled entirely with $40,000 in crisp, uncirculated cash. The incredible, desperate journey from a broken, starving 21-year-old girl to a fiercely proud, highly masterful tailor felt like an incredibly long, profound lifetime ago, but she knew with absolute, fierce certainty that she had not just simply survived the massive, freezing darkness. She had aggressively, violently conquered it. She had explicitly used the heavy, hidden fortune exactly as the old, dying master tailor had demanded. She had not run away to buy a cheap, easy life. She had completely stood her ground in the narrow, freezing alleyway. She had fiercely rebuilt the heavy tables,